The first time Elena Ortiz told her peers at the flight academy that she wanted to become a Black Hawk pilot, the laughter was so sharp it felt like shrapnel cutting into her chest. She remembered standing in the hangar that smelled of kerosene and machine oil, her hair tied back tightly beneath the brim of her cap, the desert sun pouring through the open doors. The boys in their pressed fatigues, smug in their inherited confidence, had exchanged glances that said more than their words ever could. One of them, a broad-shouldered cadet named Harlan, leaned against the ladder of a maintenance scaffold and smirked. "Ortiz, you think you're cut out for a Black Hawk? That bird chews up confidence for breakfast and spits out wreckage." The others laughed, and Elena felt the heat of humiliation rise in her cheeks. But beneath it, deeper than the sting of mockery, there was a fire. That fire had been kindled long before the academy, long before she even knew what a helicopter cockpit looked like. Growing up on the edge of New Mexico's desert, she had spent her childhood chasing dust devils and staring at the military aircraft that thundered overhead from the nearby base. Her father had worked as a mechanic, fixing cars with hands blackened by grease, while her mother stitched uniforms for soldiers. Money was scarce, opportunities scarcer, but Elena learned early that the sky didn't belong to privilege, it belonged to whoever dared to take it. At night she would lie awake listening to coyotes howl, her window open to the cool desert breeze, and promise herself that one day she'd be the one inside those roaring machines instead of watching them vanish across the horizon. At the academy, however, those promises seemed fragile against the sneers of her classmates. Black Hawks were not just helicopters. They were beasts of burden and war, heavy-lift machines that demanded precision, muscle, and nerves of steel. Most cadets spent months just learning to hover without embarrassing themselves. Elena, though, attacked the simulator like a predator. She spent hours alone in the glowing cockpit mock-up, hands trembling at first as she tried to master the delicate coordination of cyclic, collective, and pedals. The instructors noted her persistence, but her peers still saw only the girl who dared to aim higher than her station. Every mistake she made was magnified, every wobble in a hover or hard landing in the simulator was met with whispered jokes. Yet, with each stumble she grew sharper, hungrier, more determined to silence them not with words but with skill. Her first real flight was both a baptism and a crucible. The Black Hawk loomed before her on the tarmac like a crouched predator, its rotor blades stretching outward as if daring her to touch them. Climbing into the cockpit, Elena felt the vibration of the engines reverberate through her bones as the bird came alive. She gripped the controls, sweat dampening her gloves, and heard her instructor's calm voice through the headset. "Take it slow. Respect the machine." The moment the wheels lifted off the ground, 1,000 tiny corrections surged through her body, ankles twisting against pedals, hands nudging the cyclic, eyes darting between gauges and horizon. The aircraft wavered, dipped, threatened to betray her nerves, but then miraculously steadied. She was airborne, really airborne, and despite her heart hammering against her ribs, she felt a smile tug at her lips. For the first time, the fire in her chest roared louder than the doubt around her. Word of her growing skill spread slowly, grudgingly. By her third month, even Harlan had to admit, through gritted teeth, that Ortiz handled the bird with uncommon grace. But the mockery never fully ceased. Some cadets whispered that she was reckless, others claimed she was only lucky. Elena ignored them. She poured herself into every drill, nap of the earth flying at low altitude, quick maneuvers over desert ridges, simulated rescue missions under pressure. Her hands developed memory, her instincts sharpened until she could feel the helicopter's mood like a living thing beneath her. Still, she knew skill alone would not erase the doubts. She needed a moment that would prove, beyond argument, that she belonged in the Black Hawk's seat. That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. It was supposed to be a routine exercise, an endurance test flying across a canyon range notorious for sudden winds. The cadets had been warned, keep to the safe landing zones if turbulence got too rough. Most of them nodded obediently, but Elena's eyes had lingered on the maps. One sector was marked with a bold red X, unsafe, no landing zone. It was a patch of uneven desert rock near the mouth of the canyon, a place even veteran pilots avoided. The instructors said nothing more about it, only shook their heads and reminded them of the dangers. But the red X stayed in Elena's mind like a challenge. On the day of the exercise, the sun hammered down mercilessly, waves of heat shimmering off the earth. The Black Hawks rose from the tarmac in formation, their blades chopping the air in rhythmic fury. Elena's heart raced as she followed the lead bird into the canyon, walls of sandstone rising on either side. The winds came suddenly, buffeting the aircraft like invisible fists. She fought the controls, steadying the machine, her jaw tight. Through the radio, she heard Harlan's voice crack with frustration as he veered off course, heading for the designated safe zone. One by one, the other cadets called in their intentions to land at alternate sites. But Elena did not turn back. Her eyes locked onto the red X on her map, the forbidden zone. Her instructor's voice crackled through the headset. "Ortiz, don't even think about it. That site's off limits. Too uneven. You'll wreck the bird." She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and replied evenly, "Copy, sir." But her hands told another story. They guided the Black Hawk toward the rocky outcropping, every nerve in her body alive with focus. The wind howled through the canyon, rattling the fuselage, but she rode it like a surfer on a breaking wave, anticipating its shifts, countering its blows. The ground rushed up beneath her, jagged and unforgiving. In that moment, doubt and fear screamed louder than rotor blades. If she failed, she would not only destroy the helicopter but confirm every cruel laugh, every whispered remark about her arrogance. But if she succeeded, if she dared to plant this Black Hawk where none had dared, she would carve her place in the sky forever. She leveled her gaze, tightened her grip, and whispered to herself, "Let's show them." The skids kissed the rock with a jolt, the machine bucking in protest, but Elena held firm. Slowly, impossibly, the helicopter settled onto the uneven ground, rotors still whipping dust and sand into a furious halo. For a long second, silence reigned in her headset. Then disbelief cracked the airwaves. "Ortiz, you actually did it." Her instructor's voice carried no anger, only awe. Somewhere in the distance, Harlan cursed. Elena exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping her lips as adrenaline surged through her veins. She had landed a Black Hawk where none dared, and the fire inside her now blazed beyond control. The canyon landing changed everything, though not immediately in the way Elena expected. Instead of the applause she secretly hoped for, the instructors summoned her to the briefing room that evening. The walls buzzed with fluorescent lights, maps pinned across cork boards, and a pot of stale coffee sat on the table between them. Colonel Myers, a stern man with a weather-beaten face, studied her with an expression that was neither admiration nor anger but something heavier. "Cadet Ortiz," he said, voice measured, "what you did today was reckless. You disobeyed a direct order, you risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and you put yourself and this program in jeopardy." His words hit like hammer strikes, but Elena stood at attention, chin lifted, refusing to flinch. Then after a long pause, Myers leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And yet, you accomplished what none of these boys would even dare attempt. You showed me you're not afraid of the machine, or of yourself. That's the mark of a real pilot. Don't make me regret it." He dismissed her with a wave, leaving her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and resolve. Word of her forbidden landing spread through the academy like wildfire. Some cadets whispered about her recklessness, saying it was only a matter of time before Ortiz crashed and burned. Others, though grudgingly, began to respect her. A few even sought her out in the simulator room, asking quietly if she'd help them with maneuvers. Harlan, however, refused to let it go. He cornered her in the mess hall one evening, his tray slamming onto the table across from her. "You think you proved something out there? All you proved is that you're too stubborn to follow orders. That's not a pilot, Ortiz, that's a liability." Elena looked him squarely in the eye, unshaken. "Funny," she said, her voice cool, "the machine didn't seem to think so." Harlan's jaw tightened, and though he stormed away, his resentment lingered like a storm cloud above every interaction. The weeks that followed were brutal. The instructors, perhaps testing her resolve, threw Elena into increasingly difficult drills. Night flights over the desert tested her ability to read instruments when the horizon vanished into darkness. Cargo lifts demanded precision, lowering massive loads into tight clearings while rotor wash churned dust and debris into blinding whirlwinds. Once she spent 4 hours practicing auto rotations, simulated engine failures that forced her to drop the helicopter in a controlled glide, skids slamming the ground with bone-rattling force. She walked away each time with trembling hands, drenched in sweat, but also with a growing certainty. She could feel the Black Hawk as though it were an extension of herself. Her defining trial came during a storm training exercise. The cadets were flown into a mountainous sector under gathering thunderclouds, tasked with navigating through deteriorating weather. Lightning cracked against the horizon, illuminating jagged ridges, while turbulence battered the helicopters like toys in a washing machine. Many of the cadets panicked, calling to abort. Harlan, his voice breaking through the radio, begged for immediate clearance to return. Elena gritted her teeth, steadied her breath, and forced herself to trust the machine. "Read the instruments, trust the bird," she whispered to herself, fingers steady on the controls. The Black Hawk lurched and shuddered, but Elena guided it through the chaos, her focus unyielding. By the time they returned to base, most cadets looked pale, shaken, or outright defeated. Elena, exhausted but resolute, had flown her bird home as though the storm was simply another obstacle to master. Her reputation began to shift. The instructors, once skeptical, now began using her flights as examples during debriefings. Look at Ortiz's approach. Notice her timing here, clean, efficient, no wasted motion. The cadets who mocked her confidence began to watch with reluctant curiosity. Some whispered that she had nerves of steel, others admitted she had the instincts of a natural pilot. Elena didn't bask in the recognition. She knew it was fragile, conditional, always one mistake away from collapse. Instead, she doubled down on discipline, early mornings in the gym to build strength, long nights in the simulator refining maneuvers until muscle memory overrode hesitation. Every drop of sweat, every hour of exhaustion, was an offering to that fire that burned inside her. But respect and training did not erase the biases that shadowed her path. During evaluations, she noticed how instructors sometimes questioned her decisions more harshly than her male peers. When medals were awarded for top performance in certain drills, her name was conspicuously absent even when her scores were near perfect. And then there was Harlan, who grew increasingly bitter as her skill outshone his. He rallied others, whispering in corners that Ortiz was reckless, a show-off, a danger to the program. Elena heard the rumors but refused to bite. She would not let resentment derail her. Instead, she told herself the same mantra every time she strapped into the cockpit: the sky doesn't care about their opinions. It only cares about skill. Her true vindication arrived during a joint exercise with active duty units. The cadets were tasked with supporting a simulated rescue mission, inserting troops into a narrow valley to extract a downed pilot. The valley was notorious for its gusting winds and limited landing zones. Elena watched as one by one her classmates balked at the approach, calling out that conditions were unsafe. Even Harlan aborted his landing attempt, circling back in defeat. When her turn came, Elena tightened her grip on the controls and committed. She descended into the valley, rotors slicing the turbulent air, dust swirling in choking clouds. The ground crew braced, expecting her to pull up, but she pressed on, reading the wind shifts, making micro-corrections until the Black Hawk settled smoothly into the clearing. The mock troops scrambled aboard, and within seconds she was lifting out, her bird steady as if mocking the storm itself. When she returned to base, the silence was deafening. Then, slowly, applause began, not from her peers but from the active-duty soldiers who had watched the exercise. One of them, a weathered sergeant with lines etched deep into his face, clapped her on the shoulder and said, "I've seen seasoned pilots fold in that valley. You've got guts, Ortiz. Don't ever let them take that from you." His words meant more than any medal, more than any grudging acknowledgement from her peers. For the first time, Elena felt the shift in her bones. She wasn't just proving herself anymore, she was becoming the pilot she had always dreamed to be. That night, lying awake in her bunk, Elena replayed the moment again and again. The descent, the turbulence, the sheer focus that had carried her through. She thought of her parents, of the girl who had once stared at the sky through her bedroom window, whispering promises to the stars. She thought of every sneer, every cruel laugh, every whisper that she didn't belong. And she thought of the fire that had carried her this far, unbroken, unstoppable. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new doubts, new challenges. But tonight, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe not just that she could fly, but that she was born for this. The following months brought Elena closer to the moment she had dreamed of since she was a child: final evaluations. These were not simple drills or controlled simulations. They were the crucible in which cadets were judged worthy, or unworthy, of earning their wings. Fail once and you were given another chance. Fail twice and you were washed out, your dreams grounded for good. The air around the academy was charged with tension. Cadets studied maps until their eyes blurred, rehearsed emergency procedures until they muttered them in their sleep, and carried themselves with brittle confidence that cracked at the first sign of criticism. For Elena, the pressure was real, but she felt something more potent than fear. A rising certainty that all her struggles, all her scars, had brought her here for a reason. On the morning of her evaluation, she awoke before dawn, the desert still cloaked in darkness. She sat on her bunk, lacing her boots with steady hands, and listened to the low hum of nervous chatter in the barracks. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly, promising another blistering day. She carried her helmet under her arm, her stride calm, though her heart thudded with the weight of expectation. As she approached the hangar, the silhouette of the Black Hawk loomed against the orange sky, rotors still and waiting. The machine looked both menacing and beautiful, like a sleeping beast that would either carry her to glory or devour her ambition whole. Colonel Myers met her by the aircraft, clipboard in hand. His expression gave nothing away. "Cadet Ortiz," he said, "today you'll demonstrate a full mission profile. Takeoff, navigation through mountainous terrain, troop insertion under simulated hostile fire, and extraction under deteriorating weather conditions. Fail to maintain control and it's over." "Understood." Elena nodded, her throat dry. "Yes, sir." She climbed into the cockpit, strapped herself in, and took a long, steadying breath. The familiar scent of fuel, oil, and worn leather filled her senses, grounding her. When the engines roared to life, the vibrations thrummed through her bones like the beat of a war drum. Takeoff was smooth, the Black Hawk lifting into the clear morning sky with a grace that belied its weight. Elena's hands moved with instinct, her eyes scanning gauges and horizon with equal precision. The navigation phase led her across ridges where crosswinds tested her grip, but she adjusted without hesitation, the helicopter obeying her as though it had accepted her as its rightful pilot. The simulated hostile fire was more unnerving. Alarms blared in her headset, instructors triggered flares to mimic incoming threats, and voices barked rapid orders. Yet Elena kept her focus razor-sharp. She darted between ridges, used terrain for cover, and maintained altitude with unyielding control. The real trial came during the troop insertion. The landing zone was a narrow clearing surrounded by steep canyon walls, with turbulence swirling unpredictably. Through her headset, voices shouted, "Too hot! Abort!" but Elena ignored them. She read the wind, felt the birds' every shiver, and coaxed it down inch by inch. Dust swirled into a blinding storm, obscuring her vision, but she kept her eyes fixed on her instruments and her instincts. The skids touched ground with a thud, and the mock troops scrambled out. Without waiting for praise or panic, she lifted off again, heart hammering but her focus unbroken. Then came the weather phase. As if on cue, storm clouds rolled across the mountains, wind gusting and rain spattering against the canopy. Visibility plummeted. The helicopter lurched violently, alarms screaming as turbulence clawed at the rotors. Elena tightened her grip, sweat stinging her eyes, and forced herself to breathe slow and steady. "Trust the bird," she whispered. She rode the turbulence like a wave, adjusting constantly, never panicking. At one point, lightning cracked so close the cockpit glowed white, and for a heartbeat she thought the storm would tear the Black Hawk apart. But then the moment passed and her training carried her through. When she finally returned to base and set the helicopter down on the tarmac, the silence in the headset was suffocating. She powered down, removed her helmet, and waited, chest heaving. Colonel Myers approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. For a moment he just stared at her, unreadable. Then, with the faintest of smiles tugging at his weathered face, he said, "Congratulations, Ortiz. You're no longer a cadet. You're a pilot." The words struck her harder than any insult, sharper than any laughter she had endured. She felt her chest swell with a pride so fierce it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She had done it, not by fitting in, not by silencing her fire, but by letting it burn until even doubt itself was consumed. Around her, some of her peers looked stunned, others quietly respectful, and a few, like Harlan, glowered with bitter defeat. But none of that mattered. She had earned her wings and no one could take them from her. Graduation day arrived with fanfare. Families filled the stands, proud parents craning their necks as cadets marched in formation across the parade ground. Elena spotted her mother in the crowd, her weathered hands clasped tightly, eyes shining with tears. Her father, who had once fixed cars with greasy hands, stood tall, pride radiating from his rough-hewn face. When Elena's name was called and her wings pinned to her chest, the roar of applause felt like the culmination of every promise she had whispered to herself under the desert stars. She caught her parents' gaze and nodded subtly, a silent vow that their sacrifices had not been in vain. But even as the applause echoed, Elena knew her journey had only begun. Becoming a pilot was one milestone, proving herself in the field would be the true test. Black Hawks were not parade decorations. They were war machines, lifelines, beasts that carried men and women into fire and pulled them out again. The real sky was not forgiving, not bound by training exercises or safety nets. It was wild, merciless, and indifferent. And it was there, in that unforgiving crucible, that Elena would truly discover what kind of pilot she was meant to be. That night, as the celebrations faded and the cadets dispersed with their families, Elena sat alone on the edge of the airfield. The desert stretched out before her, endless and silent under the moonlight. The Black Hawks stood in neat rows, their rotors still, their hulking forms like sleeping giants. She touched the wings pinned to her chest, feeling their weight, not as a decoration but as a promise. She thought of the girl she had once been, staring at the sky from her bedroom window, mocked for daring to dream. That girl had grown into a woman who had not only flown but landed where none dared, who had faced storms, dust, and doubt, and emerged unbroken. And yet, deep inside, Elena felt the fire burning hotter than ever. She knew the world would throw new storms her way, challenges far greater than the sneers of cadets or the doubts of instructors. She welcomed them. Because now she understood something vital. Confidence wasn't arrogance and daring wasn't recklessness. They were the lifeblood of those who claimed the sky, the essence of those who refused to yield when others turned back. She closed her eyes, listening to the distant echo of coyotes in the night, and whispered into the silence, "I'm ready." Elena's first deployment came sooner than she anticipated. Barely 2 months after graduation, she was assigned to a forward operating base overseas, a dust-choked outpost surrounded by mountains that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The base was little more than a scattering of concrete buildings, tents, and a landing pad scarred by the constant churn of rotor wash. The air was dry, acrid with the smell of fuel, and the ground vibrated with the constant hum of generators. As she stepped off the transport plane, helmet under one arm and duffel slung across her shoulder, she felt the weight of reality press down. This was no academy drill, no simulator. Every bird that lifted off this pad carried lives in its belly, and every mistake here could mean death. Her unit wasted no time testing her mettle. Within days she was flying supply runs to remote outposts, threading her Black Hawk through narrow valleys where ambushes were as common as sudden wind gusts. The first time she flew low over a mountain ridge, tracer fire arced up from the ground like angry fireflies. Her crew chief shouted warnings, adrenaline surged through her veins, but Elena kept her voice steady. "Hold on, we're getting through." She banked hard, the helicopter groaning in protest, and skimmed along the ridge until the gunfire fell away. When they landed, her crew looked at her with wide eyes, the kind that silently asked, "Who is this pilot who doesn't flinch under fire?" The missions grew harder. Medical evacuations became her true trial by fire. There was no room for hesitation when soldiers' lives depended on how quickly and how smoothly she could bring her bird down into chaos. The first medevac she flew was burned into her memory forever. They were called to extract 3 wounded men from a rocky outcrop under active fire. The landing zone was barely big enough for the skids, the wind whipped dust into a blinding storm, and bullets snapped in the air around them. Her crew shouted over the headset, but Elena's focus narrowed to a single point: put the bird down. Get them out. She coaxed the Black Hawk into the clearing, skids biting uneven rock, rotors chopping the air like fury incarnate. Medics hauled the wounded aboard, and within moments she was clawing the machine back into the sky, leaving gunfire and smoke below. When they reached the base and the wounded were rushed to the field hospital, Elena remained in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands trembling violently for the first time. The weight of what had just happened sank in, the thin line she had walked between success and catastrophe. She pulled off her helmet, wiped sweat from her brow, and exhaled shakily. She knew now, more than ever, that this was no place for arrogance or showmanship. Confidence here wasn't about proving herself, it was about survival, about being the calm center in a storm of chaos so others could live. Word of her skill spread quickly among the ground troops. Soldiers began to recognize her call sign, whispering with relief when they learned Ortiz was the pilot coming to pull them out. To them, she wasn't the cadet mocked for confidence. She was the steady voice that cut through panic, the pilot who landed where others wouldn't dare. Still, among her fellow pilots, skepticism lingered. Some respected her, but others, like Captain Harlan, now assigned to the same theater, watched her with undisguised resentment. Their rivalry, born at the academy, had only sharpened in the crucible of real combat. Tension between them came to a head during a joint mission. Both were tasked with delivering reinforcements to a besieged village, pinned down by insurgents. The approach route was perilous, requiring low-level flying through a canyon riddled with possible ambushes. Harlan, as senior officer, took lead. Elena followed in formation, her bird heavy with soldiers gripping their rifles tightly. As they entered the canyon, gunfire erupted from the cliffs. Harlan's voice barked through the radio, sharp and commanding, "Abort! Too hot, we're pulling out." His Black Hawk began to veer skyward, retreating from the kill zone. Elena glanced at her own troops, their faces pale, their mission unfinished. Pulling out meant abandoning the men pinned down in the village below. She felt the weight of choice slam into her chest. Disobeying meant insubordination, again. But obeying meant lives lost. She steadied her voice over the comms. Negative. I'm going in. Before Harlan could respond, she broke formation, her Black Hawk plunging deeper into the canyon. Bullets clanged against the fuselage, sparks flashing, but Elena threaded her bird through the chaos, descending into the village square. Dust and smoke swallowed them as the soldiers leapt from the bay doors, charging into the fray. Seconds stretched into eternities, but when the last man jumped, she yanked the bird skyward, engines roaring in defiance of the storm around them. By the time she cleared the canyon and returned to base, the radio was a storm of conflicting voices. Harlan furious, command demanding explanations, her crew shouting praises. When the debriefing came, the room was thick with tension. Harlan slammed his report on the table. She disobeyed a direct order. Reckless as always. Colonel Myers, now commanding in theater, sat silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Elena. Your actions saved that village. But you went against protocol. Do you have anything to say? Elena lifted her chin, voice steady. Sir, I made a judgment call. I believe the mission, and those lives, were worth the risk. I stand by it. The colonel studied her for a long beat, then nodded. Understood. Next time, Ortiz, make sure your judgment is sharper than your defiance. His words carried both warning and respect. Harlan glared, jaw tight, but Elena knew the truth was plain for all to see. When the choice came between fear and action, she had acted. And action had saved lives. In the weeks that followed, missions piled on, each testing her further. She flew night raids under cover of darkness, her rotors whispering through black skies lit only by distant flares. She hovered above ridgelines to drop ropes for soldiers descending into hostile valleys. She endured long hours in the cockpit, her muscles aching, her mind sharp even when exhaustion clawed at her. Each flight etched deeper lines of experience into her, shaping her into not just a pilot, but a warrior who carried others' lives in her hands. One evening, after a particularly grueling mission, Elena sat with her crew outside the hangar, watching the desert sun dip below the mountains. The air was cool, the sky painted in fire and gold. Her crew chief, a grizzled veteran named Jackson, leaned back against a fuel drum and said, You know, Ortiz, they can call you reckless, stubborn, whatever they want. But out there, when the bullets start flying, I'd trust you over anyone. The words landed heavy, more valuable than any medal or commendation. Elena simply nodded, the fire in her chest burning brighter, fueled not by mockery anymore, but by the trust of those who counted on her. That night, she wrote in her journal, something she rarely shared with anyone. They mocked my confidence. They thought it was arrogance. But confidence isn't about believing nothing can go wrong, it's about believing you can handle it when it does. And today I know I can. She closed the book, slipped it under her pillow and drifted into a restless sleep, already dreaming of the next mission, the next challenge, the next storm she would fly through. By the middle of her first year in combat, Elena had already carved a reputation that spread far beyond her unit. Soldiers spoke of her with a mix of awe and gratitude, telling stories of how Ortiz would fly into hell itself if it meant pulling a wounded man out. Her call sign, Valkyrie, had been given by a squad she once rescued under heavy fire, and it stuck. To the ground troops, she was the one pilot who would never abandon them, no matter how bad the situation became. To some of her fellow aviators, however, the name carried an edge of resentment. They said she was reckless, that she thrived too much on danger, that one day her luck would run out and she would take others down with her. Elena ignored the whispers. She didn't fly for luck or for glory, she flew because every time she looked into the eyes of a wounded soldier lifted onto her bird, she knew exactly why she was there. Her missions became increasingly daring as the conflict escalated. Convoys ambushed in mountain passes called for her to provide aerial support, weaving her helicopter between cliffs to draw fire away. Villages cut off by insurgents relied on her drops for food, water, and medicine. There was never a guarantee of safety. Each flight was a gamble, every landing a negotiation with death. Yet, time after time, Elena brought her crew and passengers home. The Black Hawk became an extension of her will, its groans and rattles no longer frightening but familiar, like the growl of a trusted companion. She learned to anticipate problems before they unfolded, reading the tremble of the rotors, the shiver of the fuselage, the way the wind tugged at the bird's frame. It wasn't just flying anymore, it was a dialogue, a constant conversation between pilot and machine. But war was never without cost. Elena began to feel the weight of faces she couldn't save. There were missions where the wounded died before they reached the hospital, their last breaths taken under the thunder of her rotors. There were comrades lost when ambushes proved too well prepared, when air support arrived seconds too late. Each loss carved a mark into her, invisible but heavy. At night she sometimes woke drenched in sweat, hearing the phantom echoes of gunfire, the cries of men calling for help. She wrote in her journal more often now, trying to pour the weight onto paper so it wouldn't crush her spirit. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep going even when fear claws at your throat. Her rivalry with Harlan reached its boiling point during an operation that was supposed to be straightforward. 2 Black Hawks were tasked with inserting troops into a mountain valley to cut off an enemy supply line. Harlan led the mission, Elena followed in support. The weather turned quickly, clouds rolling in and winds cutting through the canyons with vicious force. Harlan pressed forward despite worsening conditions, his voice clipped and irritated over the comms. When turbulence battered his bird, he ordered Elena to hold position while he attempted the landing. From her vantage point above, Elena could see what he couldn't. The narrow clearing he was aiming for was unstable, riddled with boulders that would shear his rotors if he tried to set down. "Abort, Harlan," she called over the radio. "Your LZ isn't safe." "Stay out of it, Ortiz," came his sharp reply. "I've got this." Elena clenched her jaw as she watched his bird descend, the wind tossing it dangerously close to the cliffs. Her gut screamed disaster. She had seconds to decide. Disobeying would mean undermining a senior officer in front of the entire mission team, but holding back would mean watching men die. She shoved the collective down, diving her Black Hawk into the canyon, and swung low over the clearing. Her voice cut through the comms, steady as stone. "My LZ now. Divert to secondary zone." The tone left no room for argument. She brought her bird down into the narrow space, rotors slicing dangerously close to the canyon walls, but she landed clean. The troops piled out, fanning into position. Above, Harlan swore furiously but had no choice. He diverted, circling toward the alternate site. When the mission ended, both birds returned safely, but the debriefing was explosive. Harlan accused her of insubordination, recklessness, undermining command authority. Elena, however, stood her ground. "Sir, his landing zone was a death trap. I made a judgment call to prevent a crash. My crew, my passengers, and his, are alive because of it." Colonel Myers, now seasoned to Elena's brand of defiance, regarded them both. "Ortiz, your instincts are sharp. But discipline matters. You can't save lives if you erode the chain of command. You two need to find a way to work together, or neither of you will last out here." The meeting ended without resolution, but the rivalry had shifted. Harlan's anger was still there, but beneath it was something new, reluctant acknowledgement that Ortiz had been right. Weeks later, a mission would prove just how vital that reluctant respect would become. A convoy had been ambushed deep in the mountains, and intelligence reported multiple wounded pinned down in hostile territory. 2 birds were dispatched, Elena's and Harlan's. The approach was brutal, gunfire lacing the sky, RPG trails arcing dangerously close. As they entered the valley, Harlan's Black Hawk took a hit, one engine sputtering, smoke trailing. "I'm losing power," his panicked voice blared through the headset. Elena didn't hesitate. "Divert altitude. I've got you." She maneuvered beneath his bird, positioning herself in a way that shielded his descent. With one engine struggling, Harlan barely managed to set down in a clearing, rotors chopping dangerously close to collapse. Elena circled once, then dove into the valley herself, dust exploding around her as she touched down beside the convoy. Medics rushed aboard with the wounded, bullets snapping against the fuselage. Over the radio, Harlan's strained voice crackled, "I can't lift out, not with one engine down." Elena's stomach tightened. That meant she would have to haul double, her own wounded plus Harlan's stranded crew. She scanned the valley, assessing. It was madness, but there was no alternative. "Load them all on mine," she ordered. Her crew chief protested, but she cut him off. "We don't leave them." The weight was unbearable. As the last man was dragged aboard, the Black Hawk sagged under the load, straining against its own limits. Elena gritted her teeth, coaxing every ounce of power from the engines. Slowly, painfully, the bird clawed into the air, rotor wash tearing through the valley. The altimeter crept upward, the machine groaning, and for a terrifying moment it seemed they would crash back down. But Elena held firm, coaxing, urging, commanding the machine with every fiber of her being. Finally, the bird cleared the ridge, the valley falling away beneath them. The cabin was crammed with wounded soldiers and Harlan's shaken crew, but they were alive. Back at base, When the bird settled onto the pad and the wounded were rushed to safety, Elena remained in the cockpit, drenched in sweat. Harlan approached, his usual arrogance stripped away. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You saved my life today. Saved all of us. I was wrong about you." Elena met his gaze, seeing for the first time not resentment but respect. She nodded, her voice steady. "It's not about me. It's about the mission." But inside she felt something shift. She had not only proven herself to those who mocked her, she had earned the respect of even her harshest rival. That night, writing in her journal, she reflected, "They said confidence was arrogance. But confidence is knowing when to act even when no one else will. It's landing in chaos, lifting impossible weight, daring when others turn back." And today, confidence saved lives. The storm swept in during the early hours of dawn, a violent wall of dust and wind that roared across the training grounds like a living thing. The outpost was caught off guard. Alarms blared, tents shook, and the massive blades of helicopters tied down on the pad groaned in the ferocious gusts. For the recruits it was chaos. For Captain Alara Vance, it was a proving ground she had been waiting for, though not in the way she imagined. Her chance to show them what she was capable of came not with ceremony or assignment, but with the wrath of nature itself. Men scrambled, cursing the storm, and shouted for cover as visibility shrank to a few feet. Yet in the confusion, a distress call came through on the comms. One of the patrol units had been stranded in a dried wadi several kilometers out, their vehicle overturned and their wounded exposed to the storm. Someone needed to lift them out and someone needed to do it fast. The instructors argued, their faces pale. No pilot in their right mind would fly into a dust storm of this magnitude. It was suicide. But Alara stepped forward, her eyes narrowed, her voice steady as she volunteered. They laughed at her, mocked her confidence once more, certain this would break her. But she simply secured her flight helmet, walked to the Black Hawk like it had always been waiting for her, and began pre-flight checks with hands that didn't tremble. The wind howled around her, buffeting the helicopter so hard it rocked on its landing gear. Sand whipped across the windshield like bullets of grit, scratching at the glass. Through the haze, figures in the camp watched her as though she were walking into the jaws of a beast. They whispered wagers under their breath. How long until she aborted, how long until fear caught up with her? But Alara ignored it all. Her world shrank to the cockpit, to the familiar smell of oil and metal, to the click of switches and the hum of instruments struggling against the storm. She called in her mission intent, her voice calm across the radio. She was going after the stranded patrol. One of the commanders barked at her, calling it reckless, demanding she stand down, but she refused to acknowledge him. With a deep breath, she pulled the Black Hawk to life, rotors chopping into the wall of wind, defying it, carving out a space where human will could wrestle against nature's fury. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath as she lifted off, the helicopter straining, skidding slightly, then rising into the storm like a leviathan breaking free of the sea. Inside it was like navigating through a world erased. Her forward visibility was a swirling wall of ochre and red, the storm pressing against the machine trying to push her back to the ground. She relied on instruments, on instinct, on the thousands of hours of study that had trained her to see with more than just her eyes. Sweat soaked her back beneath the harness, but her hands never wavered. She whispered to the Black Hawk like it was alive, coaxing it, commanding it, reminding it of what they both were built for. "Hold with me," she murmured, adjusting pitch and yaw, muscles straining with the constant corrections. Every meter gained felt like a duel with gravity, with chaos, with the mocking voices of those who never believed. Yet she pressed forward, scanning her instruments for the coordinates of the stranded patrol. The radio crackled faintly through the storm, the panicked voices of the soldiers who thought no one would come. Her jaw tightened. They would not be abandoned. Minutes stretched into an eternity as she fought her way across the desert, her mind locked in a strange state of clarity. It was as though every humiliation, every sneer and laugh thrown at her since the academy had melted into this one crucible. She was no longer flying just for herself. She was carrying the weight of every woman who had been told she couldn't, every dream crushed under someone else's ridicule. Through the shriek of the storm, the coordinates finally aligned, and her sensors picked up the faint signal of the patrol's distress beacon. She dropped lower, battling turbulence that made the Black Hawk lurch violently. Sand clawed at the fuselage, rattling like 1,000 hands trying to drag it down. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted faint movement below, the silhouettes of men clinging to the wreck of their overturned vehicle, shielding a wounded comrade whose blood stained the sand dark. They looked up in disbelief as the thunder of rotor blades descended through the storm, a phantom made flesh. Landing was impossible in such terrain, but Alara was not deterred. She maneuvered the helicopter into a precarious hover, less than a meter off the ground, the downdraft whipping the sand into a blinding maelstrom. The crew chief slid the side door open, shouting over the roar, throwing down the rescue line. The patrol scrambled, half carrying their wounded, eyes squinting against the storm, their faces masks of astonishment. One by one they clung to the rope, hauled up into the safety of the bird while Alara held the Black Hawk steady, arms straining, vision flickering between instruments and the chaotic blur outside. It was a test of endurance, of willpower, of absolute trust in her own ability. The last man scrambled aboard, slamming the door shut against the storm. The crew chief's voice crackled in her headset, "We've got them all. Let's get the hell out." Relief surged through her chest, but she couldn't relax yet. The storm wasn't finished with her. The return flight was an even greater battle, the Black Hawk groaning as crosswinds shoved it sideways, threatening to flip it. Alara grit her teeth, muscles screaming, every correction a fight for survival. Sweat poured into her eyes, but her focus never faltered. Somewhere inside her, a fierce joy began to rise, a fire fed by the knowledge that she was proving them wrong in real time, that she was doing what they said could not be done. The patrol, exhausted and bruised in the back, watched her with awe, realizing they were alive only because of her defiance. When the outlines of the outpost finally emerged through the dust, the camp erupted in disbelief. Soldiers ran to the pad, shielding their faces from the storm as the Black Hawk descended, its landing gear kissing the ground with a controlled precision that silenced every doubter. The rotors slowed, the storm howled on, and Alara powered down with deliberate calm, her breathing heavy but steady. She pulled off her helmet, her hair damp with sweat, her face streaked with grit. The rescued men stumbled out, one of them turning to salute her with trembling hands, his eyes glassy with gratitude. Around the pad, the same recruits and officers who had mocked her now stood in stunned silence. No jeers. No laughter. Only the raw, undeniable respect earned not by words but by action. Alara stepped down from the cockpit, her boots crunching on the sand, her gaze sweeping over them all. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't need to. The Black Hawk behind her, still humming with residual power, spoke louder than anything she could say. In that moment, the storm seemed to bow, the desert itself bearing witness to what she had done. They had mocked her confidence, tried to shatter it, but she had answered in the only language that mattered, courage in the face of the impossible. And though the dust still clawed at the sky, within the camp a new clarity settled like sunlight breaking through clouds. Captain Alara Vance had not only landed a Black Hawk where none dared, she had rewritten what daring meant. The storm did not end with Alara's landing. It raged for hours, hammering the camp as if nature itself sought to erase their fragile foothold in the desert. Yet inside the outpost, the atmosphere had changed completely. Soldiers who once sneered now spoke her name in hushed tones, retelling the impossible rescue with wide eyes and disbelieving laughter. Some even began to embellish the details already, calling it madness, calling it divine intervention, calling it proof that fate had marked her as something different. For Alara, however, the storm within had finally settled. She didn't bask in the praise or the stunned silence. She only sat quietly in the mess hall, sipping lukewarm coffee, her body still aching from the brutal fight with wind and sand. What she had done had not been for them, not even for the men she'd saved, though she was glad for their survival. It had been for herself. To prove, once and for all, that her belief in her own ability had never been misplaced. And yet, though she carried herself with composure, she could feel the weight of new eyes on her. The eyes of commanders who saw not just a reckless volunteer, but a weapon they hadn't realized they possessed. The next morning brought an unusual summons. Instead of being ordered to another round of routine training, Alara was called to the operations tent. There, seated at a long table cluttered with maps and dust-stained radios, were senior officers she had rarely seen up close. Their expressions were measured, but their attention sharp, as if weighing her soul as much as her skill. The mission they laid before her was unlike the storm rescue, calculated, deliberate, and dangerous. A reconnaissance drone had been shot down deep in hostile territory, carrying not only sensitive surveillance data but also experimental hardware the enemy could not be allowed to capture. A ground team would be too slow, too vulnerable. The only way to reach it before it was discovered was by air. But the crash site lay within a canyon notorious for violent wind shears and ambushes. To send a helicopter there was almost unthinkable. Almost. Unless, of course, there was someone reckless, or brilliant, enough to attempt it. Alara understood before they even asked. This was not just another mission. This was their test to see if her stormborn legend was real, or just luck wrapped in sand and chaos. She accepted without hesitation. Not because she craved their approval, by now she had learned to live without it, but because the challenge called to her. Every instinct told her this was what she had trained for, what her endless nights of study and simulation had prepared her to face. The commanders gave her 1 day to prepare. 1 day to inspect the Black Hawk, to walk the canyon walls through satellite images, to calculate wind drift and escape vectors until the numbers lived in her blood. She worked without rest, her hands blackened with grease, her eyes burning from hours of focus. Other pilots passed by, watching her in silence, some with grudging respect, others with quiet awe. None mocked her anymore. She had passed beyond their petty ridicule. She had entered the realm where every pilot dreams to live, at the edge where fear and mastery meet. That night, before the mission, she stood alone at the edge of camp, gazing out at the desert stars. The storm had cleared, leaving the sky sharp and endless, the Milky Way spilled like fire across the black. She thought of her father, who had once told her that the sky belongs to those who dare take it, no matter who tells them they cannot. She thought of every cadet who had whispered behind her back, every instructor who had doubted her, every moment when she had been tempted to give in. And then she thought of the Black Hawk waiting in the hangar, silent but alive in her mind, like a companion who had shared her trials and would share them again. Tomorrow, she whispered to the night, we show them what we were meant for. Dawn came sharp and golden, the desert glowing as though it had been reborn after the storm. The mission briefing was quick, almost perfunctory. Everyone knew the risks, everyone knew the stakes. Ilara climbed into the cockpit with the same steady calm as before, but her heart beat faster. Not with fear but with anticipation. As the rotors spun and the helicopter lifted into the morning air, she felt the familiar thrill surge through her veins. Flying had always been more than a skill, it was freedom, defiance, proof that limits existed only to be shattered. Her co-pilot, a grizzled veteran assigned to watch her performance, glanced at her with wary eyes. You know this canyon eats pilots alive, he muttered. Ilara only smiled faintly beneath her visor. Then it won't know what to do with me. The flight to the canyon's mouth was deceptively calm. The desert stretched beneath them in waves of ochre and gold, the horizon shimmering with heat. But as they descended into the jagged throat of stone, the calm shattered. Winds funneled between the cliffs, striking the Black Hawk from all sides, tossing it like a toy. Rock walls loomed close, narrow passageways twisting unpredictably. Ilara gripped the controls with the same iron steadiness she had shown in the storm, her entire body attuned to the helicopter's movements, feeling each gust as though it struck her own skin. Sweat slicked her palms, but her hands never faltered. The co-pilot cursed as they skimmed dangerously close to a cliff face, but Ilara corrected with a precision that seemed impossible at such speeds. Her eyes darted between instruments and the chaotic blur of stone and sky, her mind balancing calculation with instinct. This was no ordinary flight, it was a duel with the canyon itself, a battle of wills between pilot and nature. At last the crash site came into view. The drone lay crumpled against a ledge halfway up the canyon wall, its wings shattered but its core intact. But they weren't alone. As the Black Hawk approached, gunfire erupted from hidden positions along the cliffs. The enemy had reached it first. Tracers lit the air, bright lines of death streaking toward them. The co-pilot shouted, reaching for countermeasures, but Ilara was already in motion. She dropped the Black Hawk into a dive, engines screaming, rotors skimming the canyon floor by meters. Bullets sparked against rock where they had been seconds before. Her maneuvers were not reckless, they were artistry, threading the helicopter through stone pillars and crosswinds in ways that defied belief. She twisted, climbed, rolled the bird sideways to squeeze through a narrow gap, every move so daring the co-pilot could only grip his harness and pray. And still she pressed forward toward the wreck. Hovering was impossible under fire, but Ilara had already devised her plan. She angled the Black Hawk to shield the rescue crew, using the helicopter itself as cover while they rappelled to secure the drone's core. The machine shuddered with impacts, the world a storm of noise and heat, but Ilara's focus never wavered. Every second stretched into eternity, her muscles locked in the balance between control and chaos. Finally the crew signaled, the package was secured. With a roar, Ilara pulled the Black Hawk into a vertical climb, engines straining, gunfire chasing them like angry wasps. The canyon walls seemed to close around them, but she forced the bird upward, until at last they burst into open sky, sunlight flooding the cockpit like salvation. The camp awaited their return in tense silence. When the Black Hawk touched down, battered but unbroken, cheers erupted, rolling across the desert like thunder. Soldiers rushed forward, some laughing, some shaking their heads in disbelief, some simply staring at her as though she were something more than human. Ilara powered down calmly, unstrapped, and stepped from the cockpit. The commanders approached, their faces unreadable, but their eyes carried something new, respect that could not be faked and perhaps a flicker of fear. She had done what none of them dared. She had flown where death waited and returned not only alive, but victorious. And in that moment, standing on the sunlit pad with dust swirling around her boots, Ilara realized something profound. She no longer needed their approval. She had become her own legend. The Black Hawk touched down on the rough plateau with a shuddering thump, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Dust swirled in violent clouds, rocks clattered down from the ridge, and the echo of the rotor blades rolled through the valley like distant thunder. Layla sat in the cockpit, hands firm on the controls, eyes narrowed against the chaos outside. She had done what no one else had dared attempt. She had landed a Black Hawk in a place others called impossible. But there was no time to savor the victory. The mission was not finished. As the skids dug into the rocky ground, her crew leapt into action, unbuckling, shouting commands and preparing to move their cargo. Inside the fuselage, the medics readied stretchers, their expressions taut with urgency. Lives depended on this moment, and Layla knew the weight of every second. She shut down the engines to a low idle, her ears ringing with the memory of every mocking word she had endured in training. Too confident, they had said. Too reckless. Yet here she was, making the impossible real. The plateau was small, barely large enough for the helicopter to sit without sliding. On one side, the jagged drop of a canyon plunged into darkness. On the other, sharp ridges rose like the teeth of some monstrous beast. The storm that had plagued them all night still howled across the peaks, tugging at uniforms, pushing at the rotors, throwing grit into every open space. Layla glanced at her crew chief, who gave her a sharp nod. The helicopter was steady, for now. The soldiers and medics began moving, hauling gear, setting up a quick perimeter. The wounded climbers, stranded for 2 days in the freezing heights, were visible just a few meters away, huddled against the rocks, their bodies swaddled in torn fabric, faces pale with exhaustion. The sight of them sent a surge of determination through Layla's chest. She had not fought her way here just for glory. She had come for them, to prove to herself and to everyone else that her confidence was not arrogance. It was faith backed by skill. The first climber was carried aboard, his leg twisted unnaturally, his breathing shallow. Layla heard the medic shout over the noise, calling for supplies, checking vitals. She didn't leave her seat yet, she couldn't, not until she knew the Black Hawk was secure. The wind battered the aircraft again, and for a moment she thought the skids might slip on the uneven ground. Her hands tightened on the cyclic and collective instinctively, adjusting for balance, ready to lift off in a second if things turned dire. But the Black Hawk held steady. This machine, this beast of the air, was more than metal and fuel, it was a partner. And right now, it was trusting her as much as she trusted it. Another pair of climbers were hauled in, one conscious but delirious, the other shivering so hard his teeth clattered audibly even over the roar of the blades. Every successful rescue fueled her strength, but every new body loaded into the cabin reminded her of how thin their margin for error truly was. Suddenly a shout rang out. One of the soldiers pointed toward the ridge, where loose rocks were tumbling down in an ominous spray. The storm had loosened the slope above them, and a small landslide was forming, trickling toward the plateau. If it hit the skids, the helicopter could be knocked sideways, and on such narrow footing, that would mean disaster. Layla's instinct screamed at her to lift off immediately, but the last climber hadn't been brought aboard yet. She saw him, half buried under a slab of rock, his arm pinned, his face streaked with blood. 2 soldiers were struggling to free him, their efforts frantic and desperate. For a split second, doubt stabbed through her. If she took off now, she'd save the helicopter and the people already inside. If she waited, she might lose everything. Her hands trembled on the controls, sweat slicking her gloves. This was the crucible of confidence, choosing whether to trust herself when the stakes could not be higher. She gritted her teeth and stayed. "You've got 30 seconds, she shouted, her voice cutting through the storm, amplified by sheer force of will. The soldiers redoubled their efforts, straining, heaving at the rock. Layla kept the Black Hawk humming, the rotors steady, adjusting against every gust of wind, watching the slope with hawk-like intensity. Dust choked the air as more stones tumbled closer, bouncing and clattering around the helicopter. Then, with a final grunt, the soldiers dragged the last climber free, throwing him across their shoulders and sprinting toward the open door. The medics yanked him inside, their hands already working, and the crew chief gave her a hard slap on the shoulder. "We're good. Go." The moment the words hit her, Layla pulled the collective and pushed the cyclic forward, coaxing the Black Hawk back into the air just as a cascade of rocks thundered across the plateau, swallowing the spot where they had been. The helicopter lurched upward, skimming dangerously close to the ridge before she banked hard, pulling into the turbulent sky. The storm battered them with all its fury, the valley echoing with the wail of the wind and the growl of the engines. The weight of the rescued climbers pressed heavy in the fuselage, but the Black Hawk climbed, fought, and rose higher. Layla's jaw was set, her eyes sharp. Every movement of her hands was precise, measured, born of years of training and the unshakable confidence that had carried her through every trial. The storm seemed determined to drag them back, but she refused to yield. Her crew's lives, the climbers' lives, even her own pride were bound to this moment. She drove the helicopter through the tempest, guiding it like a ship through a raging sea, until at last the storm began to thin, the clouds breaking into fractured patches of moonlight. When they broke free of the worst of it, the valley stretched beneath them, dark and endless, but safe compared to the chaos behind. In the cabin, the medics worked furiously over the injured, their voices steady despite the urgency. Layla stole a glance through the cockpit glass, seeing the distant glow of the base on the horizon. Relief threatened to overwhelm her, but she held it in check. Not yet. Not until they were home. The helicopter thundered forward, strong and unwavering, carrying with it not just bodies but proof. Proof that confidence, when rooted in skill, could achieve the impossible. Proof that every mocking voice had been wrong. Proof that Layla's belief in herself had not been arrogance but courage. By the time the Black Hawk touched down at the base, dawn was breaking, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The wounded were rushed out, the medics shouting for stretchers, doctors sprinting to meet them. Layla powered down the engines, her hands finally loosening from the controls, trembling with exhaustion. She sat there in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it all crash over her. Around her, the crew cheered, patted each other's shoulders, their laughter edged with relief. One of them leaned into the cockpit, grinning from ear to ear. "No one else could have pulled that off," he said simply. Layla let out a slow breath, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to gloat. The flight itself had said everything. Later, when the story spread, when officers and soldiers alike whispered about the woman who had landed a Black Hawk where none dared, the mocking words faded into silence. In their place came respect, awe, and the quiet acknowledgement that confidence had carried her farther than fear ever could. Layla didn't chase their approval anymore. She didn't need to. She had faced the storm, defied the impossible, and returned with lives saved and dignity intact. As the sun climbed higher over the rugged peaks, she walked away from the Black Hawk, her boots crunching on gravel, her shoulders squared. She had proven herself not through argument, not through defiance, but through action. And though she would fly again, face other storms and fight new doubts, this moment would always be hers. The day she silenced the world by landing where no one else dared. The end.